Joe Biden has delivered a forceful speech on the future of America's democracy, launching a scathing attack on the Republican Party. The US president travelled to Pennsylvania for the rare prime-time address.
Joe Biden walked onto the stage in front of the same building where the Declaration of Independence was signed to broadcast his message to homes across America that his opponents are a threat to American democracy.
We're all called by duty and conscience to confront extremists who put their own pursuit of power above all else. Democrats, independents, mainstream Republicans, we must be stronger, more determined, and more committed to saving American democracy than MAGA Republicans are to destroying American democracy.
President Biden paused momentarily for the sounds of sirens, as well as the protesters chanting nearby.
Notwithstanding those folks you hear on the other side there, they're entitled to be outrageous.
Despite some of the divisive comments delivered in the speech, the president pledged again to be a uniting force.
We are the United States of America, the United States of America.
But that message of unity was not being heard by Republicans. They say this was a political stump speech in disguise as the Democrats stared down the midterm elections.
Joe Biden has launched an assault on the soul of America, on its people, on its laws, on its most sacred values.
The president has recently escalated his rhetoric over the Republican Party, calling so-called MAGA Republicans fascists. This 24-minute address left no doubt where his political focus will be in the coming months.
There is no place for political violence in America, period. None, ever.
Annalise Nielsen, Sky News, Washington, D.C.
Joining us now is Alex Shephard, reporter for The New Republic. Alex works, of course, for an online magazine which focuses on US politics and culture. What do you think of Joe Biden, Alex?
I think this is one of the more interesting speeches that he's given in his time in office. I think in large part because he's really pitched himself as the sort of uniting force. And the Democratic Party, but Biden in particular, have tried to sort of still occupy the political center, sort of tried to isolate Donald Trump in the past as this kind of unique, malevolent force in American politics. What you saw on Thursday evening was that Joe Biden was extending that kind of cancer, not to the Republican Party at large. I think he was trying to thread a needle here. He kept repeating the phrase MAGA Republicans, something that you've been hearing again and again from him over the last few weeks. There's this idea that certain forces within the Republican Party have started to take over. You're seeing this in midterm races across the country. And I think that for Democrats, they're also trying to push this message that these Republicans who deny that the 2020 election was lawful and legitimate, even though there's no evidence to suggest that it was either of those things, that they're a dangerous force to American democracy and that they must be stopped. And I think that we've seen over the last month, or really 2 months, the Democrats have momentum for the first time in this midterm cycle, something that's very, very rare for the party that occupies the White House. And now you're seeing Biden in particular try to drive this message home, which is to vote for Democrats if you want to not only keep, whether you like it or not, the sort of domestic and foreign policies of this administration, but I think also if you value the access to the ballot box and democracy itself.
He had one man in his mind, though, didn't he? You could tell by the language. No place for political violence, and it was very interesting to sort of notice the nuance of what he was doing there.
It's a very interesting speech in part because he mentions Donald Trump's name only twice, both times at the beginning of the speech. And in general, you can see him sort of strain to make this a larger speech about the midterm elections. But I think we'll talk about this in a moment. But I think that Donald Trump's re-entry into the sort of national political discourse, I think it may be hard to understand from so far away just how distant he's been over the last 2 years. He's received comparably, extraordinarily little mainstream press coverage. I think the Democrats see this as a real gift, and Biden's trying to drive that home here. He's reminding voters about what happened on January 6th, but also that could happen again, that Republicans have continued to press not just to restrict access to the ballot box across the country, but that they're also nominating candidates in states, in important swing states across the country, who have essentially pledged that they'll throw their state's electors towards the Republican candidate in the race, regardless of what the electoral outcome is, citing bogus allegations of fraud.
He's got plenty of supporters, Donald Trump, but he has a huge amount of people that are anti-him right around the world. And I think from that lens, a lot of the anti-Trump people are looking at what has gone on at Mar-a-Lago and so many events to think that how could this guy possibly be in the race to re-enter the White House?
I mean, I think one of the things that's been sort of fascinating since the FBI's raid of his home in Mar-a-Lago, which also doubles as a country club, is that it does feel like that's starting to be driven home here in America more and more. He still does have a tremendous hold on the Republican Party itself. I think there's no doubt if the Republican primary was held at this moment, he would not only win it, but that he would win it handily. Ron DeSantis has sort of emerged as a sort of he would give Trump a run for his money, but in polls, Trump still usually occupies at least 60% of support, and yet his criminal liability has just expanded enormously. And I think that you saw him, I think, really get in over his skis with these classified documents, and that the Department of Justice does not want to prosecute a former president. And yet, for a year, they were asking him to return these documents that they knew he had. And he and his lawyers continued to lie about them over and over again. And what we saw, I think, with these photos that were released, I believe, on Wednesday, was essentially the equivalent of what we, would call a drugs on the table picture from the FBI. That the Department of Justice was saying, look, you're saying that these documents were planted. You're saying that you had somehow unclassified them before you left office. Here they all are. This is the clearest evidence of a crime that we've seen. He was able to wriggle out of, 2 impeachments before, I think, under fairly ridiculous arguments, and yet there was still a sliver of ambiguity that he could hide behind. What we're seeing with this raid is that there is no ambiguity here. The president took classified documents from the White House and held on to them after he became a private citizen. That is very clearly a crime.
A lot of people talk colloquially here about anti-Australian sentiment or anti-Australian. That's very anti-Australian. And America, the US, is a very proud nation. Is there a bit of a sentiment amongst many that what he has done and continues to do is anti-American?
I think one of the things that's been interesting about this particular instance is that there's been a kind of rallying around Trump, even from some forces that were against him, particularly kind of more moderate forces within the Republican Party. At the very least, you have this thing that we would call anti-Trump sentiment. And what we've seen happen here is, I think, even on Fox News, you had Trump's former Attorney General Bill Barr, somebody who really marched behind him throughout his time running the Department of Justice. You have even these people are starting to break with Trump and say, look, this is very clearly a crime. In terms of the patriotism question, that's certainly been argued by many of Trump's detractors, but I think that we're just in such a highly polarized moment that essentially, everyone sort of rallies around the flag no matter what. One thing that has happened, however, is that you've seen defenses of what Trump's done shift. I think for a while the case was made that he had done nothing wrong, or even that these documents were somehow planted there by the FBI. Now what you're seeing is something that's slightly different. Trump himself is admitting more or less that he had taken these documents and refused to return them. And even his most vociferous detractors have now gone from saying he did nothing wrong to, well, he may have had the documents, but he surely wasn't showing them to spies or anything. And it's sort of irrelevant what he was doing with them. What matters is that he continued to possess them for more than a year after leaving office.
Domestically, inflation's a problem, and there's some real issues in Mississippi at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, these are slightly unrelated problems, but what we're seeing with inflation and the economy, I mean, it continues to be probably the strangest economic moment that most of the economists that I speak to regularly have seen. But inflation has, at least here in most key areas, has leveled out, although it remains extremely high. We've seen gas prices fall, albeit they're still hovering around $4 a gallon. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was just passed, may have some effects in lowering inflation, but again, most serious economists don't think it will have much of an effect one way or the other. You mentioned the infrastructure or the water situation in Jackson, Mississippi. I think this is a recurring problem here in America. We saw it in Flint, Michigan. We've seen it in many cities where the majority of the population are people of color. What's happened in Jackson is, I think, a crisis that's decades in the making. It's a city, it's more than 70% Black, I believe, and it's been seriously underfunded by Mississippi state legislature, which is majority white. white people fled that city as they did across cities across America in the 1970s. And with it, funding dried up. And what you saw was this crisis with the water pipes. And then you have these climate change related crises, which have seen widespread flooding, have damaged the city's ability to distribute water. And now, talking to people are saying that this is a problem that, could take more than $1 billion to solve. And again, it's a result of racial inequities. It's a result of the country not adequately preparing for climate change. There is money in the most recent infrastructure bill that was passed by Congress last year, but it's only about $75 million, and that's for the entire state of Mississippi. So we will see, I think, more funding going towards Jackson, but the big problem here is the racial inequities that allowed this problem to happen in the first place.
Yeah, some huge challenges at the moment. Alex, just finally, getting back to Donald Trump, if you had to put your crystal ball on the table, would you, and like me, you love sport, you like a punt, you like to tip a winner, do you think he will be in a contest for the presidency of the US down the track?
I think so. I mean, I think the only thing that would prevent him from doing so would be pretty severe criminal liability, which we may not see. He certainly won't be indicted for anything until after the midterm elections. But I think that he wants to be president again, in part because it would inculcate him from these type of criminal probes, as we saw during his last administration. I think he's telling advisors that he wants to run in part for this reason, and because he could then sort of accuse anyone who investigates him of being politically motivated, that they just want to stop his unstoppable momentum. So I do think that he will enter the race. Republicans are pressuring him to not enter until after the midterms, however, because they do see his presence, understandably, as a huge liability at this moment.
Absolutely. Alex, always good to chat. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.